Welcome to another XExamine podcast. Today we'll be talking about the new federal budget proposal, the insolvency of banks, and the crippling of the citizenry. These are just some fun things to add to the conversation about what the future is looking like and what happens when a federal government proposes an outrageous budget. What happens when a single bank becomes insolvent? Would that have any far reaching effects? And what is life looking like for the average citizen as we make our way through 2023?
What's a little deficit done to hurt anyone? Just makes your entire economy insolvent, right? How do you get people to pay for things that you already taxed them to pay for that you overspent on and underdelivered with? So I'm looking forward to seeing how Mr. Joe Biden decides that he'll raise the corporate tax rate to almost 28%. How that won't drive more people in the middle class to financial insolvency themselves.
Sounds like it's good for business. A 28% tax, sign me up. It's like,
Oh
hey,
yeah,
listen,
absolutely.
it's really not a big deal if we just ignore the last seven digits on every number.
Amazon's like, I already don't pay tax. Like, well, what is this going to do? Oh yeah, that's right. It's going to drive out all of the smaller businesses that have to pay tax because you can get to a certain size of a business where you have so many different assets and you have so many different loopholes that you're leveraging that you just don't pay it. And your CEOs and your stockholders always get the best return.
When you get to that level, you're absolutely right. You just have these very, very good accountants that can make very complicated mathematics with your taxes where you end up maybe it's a salary of 500 million for these people, these professionals, but they're going to save you billions. So they end up benefiting, and all the smaller corporations and especially the mom and pop shops don't have the resources to be able to do things like that. So anytime these kind of situations occur, it does end up just creating a moat for those that are already consolidating their monopolies or oligopolies.
Absolutely. I think what's craziest too is we're seeing enormous rises in taxes in order to pay for this outrageous proposal. I don't know if anyone's really taken a look at what the hell's going on inside here. I've only seen like a few facts and figures because, again, like every news channel is trying to spin this the best way that they can, put inside general terms. So they're not giving you actual numbers. They're giving you very hopeful estimate that this will be, this will just be amazing for America. No matter what they
What's
do, it'll just be incredible.
what's the damage on some of those numbers, or what's the total number there that they're proposing?
The figures that I was looking at, and this of course can change as it will definitely, because as soon as the other members of Congress get their hands into it, we'll figure out after a few rounds of negotiation what actually goes down. But we're looking at numbers somewhere where uh, the military budget is again close to a trillion, which to me is just absolutely insane. It's like 845 billion, something like that, for a country that's not at war right now, and who also had one of the worst military blunders for an exit that I've ever seen.
That was very
So
painful.
before we go back into that pain, I won't have everyone relive that pain again. But the biggest costs look like they're going to be Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, those the usual suspects, where we take money from hard working class people and we give it to rich people who probably don't even need it.
That is very interesting. I know it seems to be counterintuitive for a lot of people, including when I first started hearing about this, where I had heard that exact idea that Social Security is taking from the poorer working class and giving to the rich older class. And I just kind of imagined older people to not have as much money, but then I started seeing those numbers and I was like, oh, actually, okay, so there are some people that do live off of Social Security, but overall, the geriatric population is the most well off. They've had their savings accumulated over their entire lifetime. Like any group of people, it's going to be the age group that has been alive longest, that has worked the longest, that has accumulated the most savings. And so then there's this kind of leaching seed on it's like, oh, I don't work anymore, but hey, you can continue to work and give me some of that money. So it is quite strange how much we punish those that are working.
Yeah, I think something else that was really interesting to me in these last few days, learning from there's these TV news specials. I'm not sure if people have been checking them out, but there's like a lot of Medicare and Medicaid scamming that has been gone on. Some fraudulent activity that has just been completely swept underneath the rug. Um, One guy, I think he was talking about on the order of over like 100 billion in associated Medicare and Medicaid fraud has been perpetrated by people pretending to have clinics open and doing business, and really they're just shell companies and fronts for a type of fraudulent activity involving these government programs.
Wow, I wonder what kind of filters already exist or could be improved because I just think there's already so much regulation that is overwhelmingly burdensome that has a large cost associated with it. And it doesn't really seem like it's that effective because rampant, crazy, widespread corruption in huge dollar amounts still happens. Everything from people that got COVID money that were buying Lamborghinis instead of like using it to actually help run their business during a global supposed pandemic, and
Mm-hmm.
to just massive insurance, healthcare fraud. Like the what kind of checks and balances are in place because they're clearly uh, failing to catch everything, especially
Yeah,
these huge things.
very huge. I mean, we're looking at the PPP loans and the EIDL loans that have gone out, the grants or whatever they're trying to call them. And I think in some ways, politicians don't care because again, they're not necessarily affected by it. It seems that politicians nowadays have just become completely immune to the American public with anything that they do. I mean, like they can literally be killing children and they'll next voting election they're going to be like, well, he's not Donald Trump, so I want to put my D here next to who I'm voting for, get on with my day.
Hmm.
So I think there's been the same thing could be said with the Republicans as well. I mean, I think the whole sort of like cynicism has peaked in voting, involving like a complete disconnect between the purpose of voting and not being conscious of um, you know the effects that these certain politicians have had. So the other problem is that you just have a number of people who maybe they don't care themselves, like they don't even watch the news, they don't care about the financial insolvency and the blatant fraud that's been going on. It seems like business as usual, but I think we're at least we're trying to look down the road a little bit further and being like, hey, there's a cliff at the end of this path. It isn't smooth sailing. It might be smooth sailing now, but we're on coyote time, as they say.
I
Coyote
was
time
like,
for the
yeah.
audience. Yeah, I need to explain this actually. So Wile E. Coyote. I'm sorry, that's a really hard name for me to pronounce. From the old Looney Tunes commercials, he would run off the side of a cliff, and he would keep running, and there's that hilarious disconnect where he's no longer on solid ground, and then only after he realizes that he's not on solid ground he plummets. It's almost exactly what we're at right now. So that's called coyote time. It's a distance from leaving solid ground to knowing you're way fucked.
That's amazing. I've never heard that actual term, coyote time. I like it.
They use a lot in video games, I heard. So, like in platforming games, you also have a little bit of space actually off of the cliff that's programmed into the game for you to still be able to jump. Because otherwise, with the way that the screen moves, more or less back in the day, I think the excuse was like if you were playing Mario, you could jump a little bit past the edge of the block. Otherwise, it would feel unnatural. So it's a very
Uh,
interesting way that they've gone about it. But yeah, to give it a term like coyote
hmm,
time is fantastic.
hmm. I like that. That's a pretty good description of I think it was Warren Buffett's quote that when the tide goes back out to sea, you find out who's been swimming without shorts on, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, we're
And
already seeing the effects. If you want to go into what we saw this past week with those two banks, I mean, we're already getting hit with these effects.
yeah. So right now, over the past few days, Silvergate Bank is insolvent. And it's always the most frightening when a bank is insolvent because if a company's insolvent, okay, they were unable to come up with funds. But when the places who lend out the money and hold other people's money, when those places become insolvent, it's particularly worrisome. And there was a really, really good investigation done by a YouTube channel, Bull Boom Bear Bust. And some of the articles that he was citing have hilarious and very deeply disturbing titles like Silicon Valley Bank's Manhattan branch calls cops on investors trying to pull their cash out as Boston Tech CEO with $10 million in bank describes worst 18 hours of my life. The lender is seized by regulators in the largest US bank failure since the Great Recession. And then, yeah, so Silicon Valley Bank. And then it's just so crazy because the news otherwise would make it seem like a run of the mill event when you have, the SVB chief selling 3.6 million in stock a few days before the bank's failure is announced. Um, and then you have places that have, like the company Roku had cash reserves stuck in funds. 25% of their cash was stuck, which is 487 million. You got Roblox that had 3 billion in cash and securities balances locked up because they're a client at a bank. And a lot of the people that like to scoff at any mention of bank runs and just write off any concerns, there are certain aspects of insurance that we have to consider, which is we're talking about FDIC insurance. So if a bank becomes insolvent, you're guaranteed up to $250,000 as like you're essentially a creditor. A lot of people think like their money is in the bank and it's theirs, but once you give it to the bank, you become a creditor to the bank. It's kind of strange. Um, or you're some sort of lender, but it's a weird legal description. But the FDIC is only for $250,000 in any case. So when you're Roblox and you had 3 billion in cash and securities there, how much are you going to get back? What's 250,000 of 3 billion? And when you have a loss like that, then you have a tax write-off of an enormous amount. And then taxes for everyone else almost have to mathematically increase because the government has unprecedented spending with an increased proposal for this coming year, as we just mentioned. And then we have this contagion with cascade effects. Bill.com had not only their own funds locked up, but $370 million of clients' funds. So now the clients don't have access to their funds for a certain period of time. Some of it might be insurable, but it'll take a long time to get it back. A lot of the rest of it's a loss. And then everything is just compounding on compounding. It's like compounding interest in the worst way possible in a very negative light because the average US savings rate is just over 2% as of the last month. That gives everyone less flexibility to redistribute and cover their obligations. I mean, everything from all time high credit card balances that they're carrying month per month, all time high APRs that they're paying on those carried balances. People are paying a lot more for food than they used to while also having food stamp benefits cut. So both sides of the teeter totter are just being slammed out of balance. We have a lot of middle class layoffs for cushy tech jobs. People that worked pretty high up in GM and Ford are being laid off. And these people, although they have a nice reserve, I hope, they were not expecting to be laid off. So they were likely not prepared and didn't have a plan for what they would do if they got laid off. So the culmination of all of these events, the totality of the circumstance is really going to slow a recovery. I just feel like it's the Titanic that's fracturing and taking on water, and we just are going to have a hard time saving this ship from going down.
Yeah, and to intensify woes, I'm going to jump in here and tell our audience that one of the additional things that it's like, okay, what's the big deal about Silicon Valley Bank going under? Well, actually, one of the biggest things that Silicon Valley Bank does is it offers services mainly to venture capital companies, which then in turn, loan out shit tons of money to startups. So one of the major problems you're going to see here is a crippling of the mechanisms in which we have new businesses enter the market. Because right now, I don't believe that a lot of these accounts at those banks are going to be able to pay their workers. So if you work at a startup or something like that, you could be heavily affected by bill payments coming in on time due to the fact that your investment funds can't come in. Now, on top of that, too, on the other side, the payoffs, where does a lot of that venture capital money come from? Well, it comes from other companies, but it also comes from pension funds. I don't know if people knew this or not, but the public sphere often, tries to invest some of those funds that they're holding back into the market to get a return just like anybody else. So you can have public funds that were being held, in order to receive a sort of gain, be affected by this. So we will probably see some sort of government intervention, which is wrong. But if you tie all of these damn balloons together, you can only have negative feedback loops that intensify on each other. So it's like they have to keep continuously tying more and more balloons together in order to make sure that the whole thing doesn't pop.
And when you start messing with people's retirements and failing to pay out, I mean, that's a lot of those people don't have any other out because they're already retired and they've found their routine, and then they have to face this shock of all of a sudden the checks are not rolling in anymore.
Yep. So the tax burden is going to fall on those businesses that are still functioning, those that are probably not, interconnected into this giant mass cancerous tumor that we call a financial system. So you have a lot of these like smaller mom and pop shops are going to be carrying, I think, proportionally, at least in the short run, like you were explaining before, with how the tax write-offs could possibly go down. We're looking at the majority of the burden of tax going on middle class America and on small self-employed businesses, which do everything right to begin with and are just they're probably going to crumble to some extent because you're going to have increases in prices, which is necessary, obviously, because you have an increase in taxes. But at the same time, anything of input related that can be taxed, sales from other things, it's going to be just a gigantic mess. And I'm not positive about it.
And speaking of almost punitive levels of tax that are oddly specific, um, the other day, the Biden administration proposed a 30% tax on electricity used for Bitcoin and crypto mining. And they said, quote, it's hindering the transition to a low emission energy future, end quote. And we're talking about emissions, and yet there are possibly fighter jets that are going to be sent for wartime efforts to a country that is not even in NATO. And just the amount of carbon emissions from missiles and bombs that are dropped. Other people have done the math. I can't remember that math. It's absurd and it puts everything else to shame. Somebody did the math for how much, what was the carbon footprint if you buy into this stuff or if you think that it has a huge impact. Uh, Look up how much of a carbon footprint the war in Iraq caused. And that entire thing was based on the ultimately a lie that they had WMDs and therefore we needed to go there. Um, when in reality, perhaps allegedly, it was because they said that they didn't want to use the US dollar to sell their oil, and then they needed a little bit of democracy to fix that.
But God forbid I forget to recycle my Chobani yogurt after I'm done.
Save the planet. And a lot of people don't really understand the processes behind recycling. A lot of recycling can actually be quite a uh, polluting and toxic process. A lot of things can only be downcycled, meaning they're used for less and less pure substances. It's very difficult to upcycle something, which means like if something is a certain combination of different plastics, it's so difficult to separate those different components that it can only really be used for a less valuable substance instead of a more pure substance. And a lot of plastics in particular receive large chemical baths in order to reform them and make them usable again. So, yes, you're recycling, but not the energy that it took to recycle the product. The most recyclable product is glass. Glass is easy, and then you just melt it and reform it because most glass is the same. But you end
No,
up with a lot of weird situations with like anything from rubber to plastics to different metals.
I mean that makes sense too. It's interesting though, like how in the attempt to be more eco-conscious from a certain point of view, not even saying that it is a true point of view, obviously, as we're trying to point out here, the fact that the common viewpoint of these sorts of eco-consciousness can be sort of, I wouldn't say self-defeating, but they can be contradictory at times. It's like, do you want to recycle stuff or do you want to keep emissions down? And those aren't always, they don't always go hand in hand because you need to introduce energy into the system in order to change things anyway.
And there's a
So
kind of a there's a neglect about there's two sides of that ledger. There's a pro list and a con list, and there's often remarkably scant bullet points on the cons list because they just kind of want to believe that because the idea is good, that the details don't matter. The little details don't matter because what I'm thinking is I had my heart in the right place, which is the same mentality behind a certain injection that people were getting. And now that a lot of evidence-based medicine has shown some different opinions that are well substantiated that I won't get into, people still thought that even though they were making decisions based on incomplete and possibly incorrect information, that they're still the heroes. They're still the heroes of the story, and they can't see otherwise, or that there's even another perspective to be considered, and that is unsettling because we used to be the epitome of logic as the top species on this planet, and now, I mean, I don't even know how you would get to go back to this strange like individual tax on like in this case Bitcoin and crypto mining. Like, how do you know what electricity is being used for what besides like a company that does actual mining? I mean, are we going to start, well, people that use washers and dryers, that takes a lot of electricity. Are we going to have to people self-reporting on how much energy that takes, taking up 1% of the nation's electricity when they could just air dry their clothes? We're just like we're grasping at straws. We're trying to like do these things that the devil is in the details. How do you actually enact these policies? And if you really like wind, solar, like wind and solar are really cool, but a lot of solar is not super efficient. The materials needed are labor intensive, possibly sourced under questionable practices. You have wind that kills tons of wildlife and birds and just stacks bodies, and the amount of oil that is spewed out, this is literally pouring out of a lot of these wind farms, but people just want to see what they want to see in the clouds, and then they ignore everything else. Which I'm not saying I'm against sustainable energy, I'm actually very for sustainable energy. I think it's unfortunate that how it's playing out is not what people imagine it to be, and so we can fix these industries and we can have progress in the right manner, but proposing a budget that is billions of dollars over what you intake while people are strapped for cash and we're being put between a rock, a hard place, and we're inside a garbage disposal that is compressing us. And the pressure is building, and it's gonna something's gonna break, and it's already breaking with these some of these banks becoming insolvent that have these
absolutely.
cascading effects of the companies that have accounts there are frozen, and then they also have client funds there. So the roots go out so far, it just affects everybody.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's really important also to add to that. You did an excellent job too, reconnecting everything back together. I was going to do something similar, but I like the path that you chose in particular. Uh, we have, it's like we also want to return on the investment that we're getting. Like the whole point of a government program to spend money is to hopefully give us something back out of it. I mean, if we're just keeping the Walking Dead alive, I hate to say that about old people, but I mean, like this is just becoming a completely crazy amount of money being spent. Like, why is it so difficult to keep, like, why are hospital bills so expensive? It's like, oh, because there's no competition. That's really the answer that there is. There's nothing else besides there's no competition being introduced. You have a shit ton of fraud being enacted. You have people taking advantage of the system. Like, what do you think doctors are so rich? I mean, like, come on, people. It's it's getting ridiculous. On top of that, too, like I hate to say it, but it's not like our health industry really promotes cheap ways to go about remedying and making sure that our we have as much preventative access to preventative medicine as we do to actual corrective medicine. So like, because if you're in the hospital, you're already at that point where things have just gotten outside of your own control, just kind of by definition. So it's kind of crazy that we've seen such an increase in hospital care throughout the years. I'm also kind of disappointed in the way that our public has just kind of believed everything that they've heard. Because when I see a doctor, yes, I am seeing an individual who I'm putting my trust in that will help me in a manner that will improve my health. But I also have to kind of see them as a lawyer. Like, you can't fully trust whoever this human being is on the other side, especially if it's like only your first few interactions with them. What I'm upset about is that I feel like there's so much waste being enacted and control being taken away from individuals to pursue their own, self-actualization. We're seeing like like a full third of my paycheck has to be fucking taken away from me in order to keep Joe Smith alive, who's 93 years old. And because like again, like the biggest, if you look at Medicaid and Medicare, Medicare is so much more expensive, and it's for all old people. It's all for 65 and up. And I'm sorry, but there's got to be a limit to which, like, you're stealing from the youth in order to keep the dead alive.
There is a lot of inspection that is warranted here for sure. And I think I'm I'm fine with supporting these older Americans that going into it, those were the rules of the game. And so what they are receiving appears to be fair to me, at least on the surface level. Because, and also what I don't want to happen is things like Canada, where people, because euthanasia and physician assisted suicide is now legal, like tons of people are uh, using it when they wouldn't otherwise do it. There, it's not. Maybe there's some coercion going on there too, but there are people who are opting for physician assisted suicide because they can't pay the bills, and that is a tragedy that I would want to avoid at all cost. And I would be willing to bear the cost in those cases. There's definitely something a lot to be said about this, that it's not a simple yes or no in my opinion, but definitely with this healthcare system, these bills are out of control. And I think it was Tim Pool on his Timcast podcast, and a lot of people have probably had this experience or something similar to it in the neighborhood, where they get a bill for, let's say, I think he got one. I'll recreate the story as best I can with generalities. He got a bill for like $17,000 for something, and he's like, "Oh my gosh, I can't pay this." He calls them, the insurance company, or not the insurance company, sorry. He calls the hospital and tries to get like a breakdown of the prices, and then he says, "Like, I don't have insurance," and they go, "Oh, okay." And then all of a sudden, like the bill drops by like 85%, and he only has to pay a very small fraction of it. This is like very, very general, and those details are not accurate, but that's the general story he told. He got a huge bill. he's like, hey, I don't have insurance. And they go, oh, okay. And then dropped it. So if they had insurance, the insurance would have paid like these astronomical amounts. And, you're paying like $300 for 2 tablets of aspirin when the same thing, generic brand at your local like CVS or Walgreens is $4. It's like, what is the rationale for these absurd prices? And also, yeah, you're absolutely right with not fully trusting your doctor. There's nothing wrong with that, because if they are authentic and everything is evidence based and their philosophy is in line with yours, then they will be able to persuade you, because everything will be laid out. It'll be clear. If you have questions, you should always bring them up. But even the physician itself, you can reveal their biases almost, and maybe they're not even aware of them. Like the American Heart Association receives a lot of, let's call it donor money, that are funded by large pharmaceutical companies that say, yeah, we think that this is what your blood pressure should be, and we have a pill for that. Or we think that this is what a blood sugar level should be, and we have a pill for that. And,
Yeah,
or,
if most of your population's on pills and shit, it's either your population's doing something really ridiculous in which they're not living a good enough life. We're creatures made to live out inside the environment. We did co-develop in this way. And I think we're seeing this weird regression of like this need to take all sorts of medicine. I'm not saying this to be like fully against medicine. Obviously, there is medicine that helps, but there's also something to be said if your population overall is way too medicated. And I think you have a runaway problem there with the market, where there are so many incentives to make a quick buck. Not only that, but I mean, a lot of those medications, well, I shouldn't say a lot, but there are definitely a few medications that are addictive. They do end up being like they're forcing either, even if addiction isn't the right word, they are forcing some sort of dependency on the individual, which then turns into a financial dependency.
oh, I
And
like that.
so I think there's all sorts of, difficulties obviously surrounding that. And no, the government should not do anything outside of looking into these. They should be the ones going into all these different medications and just being like, hey, what the hell's going on here?
Yeah,
Like,
why
are
are so
you
many
forcing an addiction on people? Like, what the hell's going on?
I really like your use of that term dependency too. It's a nice um net to capture some of these weird cases that we have a strong feeling and suspicion that they exist, but we're not really sure how to put our finger on it. But if you see just like how many people are on all of these medications and they weren't on them before, do we really need all these? Because it seems like as we move forward in time on a timeline, people are on increasingly more and more commercial pharmaceuticals, and yet we appear to be in worse and worse health. Like we're not, our health is not getting better over time.
Right, right. We're
Our
not turning
our
into
perception,
superhumans here.
yeah, like look around. I mean, there's so
We've
many
never
people out
been more
there.
obese.
We have never been more obese. Like people that are diabetics are off the charts. Like we are destroying our bodies. We're destroying our mental states. We have lost, for the large part, our warrior mindset. We have to reach back deep within, find that indomitable spirit, because we are the best, and we're just like succumbing to very strange things, and we think that we need all these, and there are people that really do need medicine, and a lot of medicines do really work, but the exact application surely should come into question, because it just seems like what we're tripping into is out of control.
Yeah, and I think on top of this, we should add to that, like people need to realize that a lot of medical insurance, is it medical insurance? It's required in some form. I know there's a lot of weird rules and stipulations, but like the general case is that okay, so definitely if you're driving, you need to be insured, right? So we also have something similar, I would say, that you need to have some sort of medical whatever interaction with the system. So at some point in time, I think we need to rediscover those old freedoms, in which I don't mind if people want to use the government as some sort of collective in order to get collective bargaining rights for better medication and blah blah blah, which obviously isn't happening, but let's just pretend in fantasy land that I'm a Democrat and I believe everything they fucking tell me. And then we I mean it's honest at this point in time, right? Like they just can't see that they're not getting the benefits that they're promised. I don't know, maybe that's just me. But we're having this again, this weird interaction of I just want to opt out. Like I don't care if you want to use it if it works. But it's the sheer fact that it doesn't work that you have to actually rely on my money to keep the system up and running.
And when someone has been in some form of holding office for 48 years, I mean, at what point do you call it and say, hey, so how much more time do you need? How much more money do you need? Like, is it not evident that, oh, well, they just needed a little bit more time and money? It's like that we're at the maximum now. They, the people in charge, the permanent political class, are driving this ship directly into the iceberg, and they're telling everybody aboard to grab a bucket to help throw water off the ship to prevent it from sinking. Work harder. The beatings will continue until morale improves. Uh, Clearly, there is something wrong. I'm very much a subscriber to conflict theory for explanations for some of these situations that we find ourselves in. Uh, but we've given power because we allow them to have power over us. And this is the situation that we're in, where we have people that are decreeing how we live our lives, what we can think, what we can do, how we spend our money, who's a good little boy and who's a bad little boy. And yet they haven't really fixed the situation. And in fact, we're, teetering on global financial collapse. We're teetering on other forms of economic collapse. There's escalating tensions between multiple super countries that have very powerful energy weapons. It's really,
Yeah,
really wild.
it feels like
And
the
we,
state is trying to intervene, act as the good guy. No, look, you have a family for this exact reason. And so you're going to be old one day and you're going to need some help. And better to have someone that you love take care of you and they love you and you hopefully have a pleasant experience in that way than some sort of like soulless um, decade of your life at the very end, which is just you hooked up to machines staring at nurses that could care less if you croak or not, and hopefully, and sometimes probably wish for it, but at the same time, like this is not pleasant. I think we need to all agree that at the very beginning that this is not going the way that we want it to go. So we have to change then what we're doing and not just keep adding to the machine, keep trying to feed this destructive mechanism. We need to change the actual pathways things are involved in. We need to reassess and make sure that we can actually audit these things too. Like how much of this financial system is just a giant black box?
a lot of it.